Our passage this morning is Proverbs 16, verses 1 through the end of the chapter. The plans of the heart belong to man, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. All the ways of a man are pure in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirit. Commit your work to the Lord, and your plans will be established. The Lord has made everything for its purpose, even the wicked for the day of trouble. Everyone who is arrogant in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Be assured, he will not go unpunished. By steadfast love and faithfulness, iniquity is atoned for, and by the fear of the Lord, one turns away from evil. When a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. Better is a little with righteousness than great revenues with injustice. The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. An oracle is on the lips of a king, but his mouth does not sin in judgment. A just balance and scales are the Lord's. All the weights in the bag are his work. It is an abomination to kings to do evil, for the throne is established by righteousness. Righteous lips are the delight of a king, and he loves him who speaks what is right. A king's wrath is a messenger of death, and a wise man will appease it. In the light of a king's face, there is life, and his favor is like the clouds that bring the spring rain. How much better to get wisdom than gold, to get understanding is to be chosen rather than silver. The highway of the upright turns aside from evil. Whoever guards his way preserves his life. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. It is better to be of a lowly spirit with the poor than to divide the spoil with the proud. Whoever gives thought to the word will discover good, and blessed is he who trusts in the Lord. A wise of heart is called discerning, and sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness. Good sense is a fountain of life to him who has it, but the instruction of fools is folly. The heart of the wise makes his speech judicious, and adds persuasiveness to his lips. Gracious words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the body. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. A worker's appetite works for him, his mouth urges him on. A worthless man plots evil, and his speech is like a scorching fire. A dishonest man spreads strife, and a whisperer separates close friends. A man of violence entices his neighbor and leads him in a way that is not good. Whoever winks his eyes plans dishonest things. He who purses his lips brings evil to pass. Gray hair is a crown of glory. It is gained in a righteous life. Whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord.
Thank you, Mackenzie. This morning we are continuing our sermon series in the book of Proverbs and come to Proverbs 16, so we're officially kind of at the halfway point in this sermon series on Proverbs, which means we still have a ways to go. But this morning I want to begin just kind of with a question that I want you to think about as we begin our time together this morning. And the question is this: what all do you have planned for this week? So what are your plans for this week? So some of you, I assume, are planning on going to work. Others of you are planning on going to school. Others of you have some important meetings planned. Others of you have a bunch of kids' activities and sporting events to get to, and you have that planned. Others of you, I think, are homeschooling your kids. You have homeschooling planned, and all sorts of stuff. You have all sorts of stuff planned for this week. Now think about kind of the future. Right? Think about between now and the end of the year. Right? What all do you have planned between now and the end of the year? Probably some of you already have Thanksgiving plans. Some of you already have Christmas plans. Some of you already have trips planned. Some of you have deadlines at work that are planned. Okay, now I want us to extend a little bit further, right? What about the next year? The next 5 years? The next 15 years? And for some of you, like planners, the next 25, 30 years. So I know some of you already have that planned out already. So what do you have planned for that? The next year, 5 years, 15, 25 years of your life. Like, do you plan to still be living in Kansas City? Do you plan to still be working at the job and career that you're working in? Do you plan on being married? Do you plan on being single? Do you plan on having kids? Do you plan on living in a different house than you live in right now? Do you plan on being a missionary overseas? Do you still plan on being a member of this church? Like, we all have plans, don't we? And the Bible says that this is a really, really good thing. Like, the Bible is all for planning. The Bible is all for us making plans. Like in the Old Testament, we see Joseph making plans for the 7 years of famine it's about to occur. We see Esther planning for months before she appears before the king. In Acts and the end of Romans, we see Paul making travel plans and plans for his missionary journeys. All throughout the book of Proverbs, if you took notice, we saw this whole idea of planning being commended all throughout the book of Proverbs, planning for the future. Right in Proverbs chapter 6, we see the ant who's planning on preparing food in the summer. In Proverbs chapter 21, verse 5, it says, "The plans of the diligent lead to abundance, but everyone who is rash or hasty only comes to poverty." And so it's easy for us, I think, at times to think planning is anti-spiritual. Right? I think it's easy for us at times to think it's more godly, it's more spirit-driven to just wing things, to not plan for things. But the reality is, all throughout the Bible, we see planning being commended. We see making plans, preparing for things, being commended. And at the same time, we see the Bible warning against impulsiveness, warning against being hasty, warning against making rash decisions, and instead commending and emphasizing the whole idea of thinking things through and thinking about the implications, being patient and thinking about those things before you just make an impulsive, rash decision. So planning, all throughout the Bible, it's a good thing. And some of you who are like these ultra hyper planners are saying, yes, yes, yes. And you know who you are. At the same time that although planning is a good thing and the Bible commends planning, at the same time, if we're not careful, planning can be really, really dangerous. And we can fall into some pitfalls when it comes to planning. And one of those pitfalls, one of those dangers when it comes to planning is that we can make an idol out of our plans. Like we can put all of our hopes in our plans. In other words, we can say, I'm not going to be happy, I'm not going to be content, I'm not going to be satisfied until this plan comes to fruition. Until I'm married, until I have this job, until I have this career, until I have this sort of ministry, until I have this sort of lifestyle, I'm not going to be happy, I'm not going to be content until these plans are fulfilled. So we can make an idol out of our plans and put our hope in our plans. Another danger of planning is the danger of having to be in control. It's the danger of having to be in control. Like, this is why some people plan. They plan so they can feel like they're in control. And being in control makes them feel safe. It makes them feel secure. And so they plan in order to feel like they have control of their life. A third danger of planning is that planning can cause us to rely on ourselves and rely on our plans. We can put our trust, we can put our confidence in the plans that we make and the strategy that come with those plans, rather than relying upon the Lord and trusting His plans for our lives. And so again, the Bible, the book of Proverbs, yay for planning. It's all for planning. It commends planning. At the same time, those are dangers, those are pitfalls, 3 pitfalls we need to be careful of when it comes to planning and the plans that we make. And so then, here's the question. If the Bible commends planning, But if there are these real dangers and pitfalls when it comes to planning, then the obvious question is, well, then how do we plan? The obvious question is, then how do we plan in such a way that honors the Lord? How do we plan in such a way that God is pleased with our plans and how we plan? How do we plan in such a way that we don't fall into these dangers and these pitfalls that I just mentioned when it comes to planning? Well, that's a really good question, and I'm glad that you asked, because that's what we're going to see within our passage here this morning. That obviously we don't have time to dig into all 33 verses of chapter 16 here this morning. Instead, we're going to focus specifically on our time on the first 4 verses here in chapter 16. And as we focus on those specific 4 verses, what we're going to see is what I would just call 4 characteristics of wise planning. 4 characteristics of wise planning. That what these verses are going to do, they're going to give us wisdom in terms of how to plan. Wisdom and how to plan in such a way that we don't fall into these dangers and these pitfalls in our lives. And so the first characteristic that it gives when it comes to this whole idea of wise planning is this. You see this on your handout there. It's that wise planning understands that God is sovereign over our plans. That wise planning understands that God is sovereign over our plans. This is what we see right from the very get-go in verse 1 there of chapter 16. Look there with me. It says, the plans of the heart belong to man, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. So verse 1 here, it's making a contrast there, right? It's contrasting the plans of the heart with the answers of the tongue. And it says here that the plans of the heart belong to man, meaning we make plans. We plan to have a certain career. We plan to buy a house. We plan to go on a certain trip. We plan this meeting and this lunch with so-and-so. We plan to get married. We plan to remain single. We make plans. But the second line of verse 1, the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. So then what in the world does that mean? Well, there are 2 major interpretations in terms of that second line there and what that means. The second line here means in verse 1. The first interpretation is what I would call just the most popular one, which is this. It's that man plans what he's going to do. Man plans what he's going to do. Man plans what he's going to say. But what comes out of his mouth, what actually comes out of his mouth, is from the Lord. Meaning the Lord determines what man says. So that's one interpretation. The other interpretation is this. It's that man plans what he's going to do, but the answer as to whether or not he carries it out, the answer as to whether or not the man actually does it, is from the Lord. Meaning the Lord determines whether or not man actually fulfills and accomplishes what he has planned. So those are the 2 primary interpretations when it comes to verse 1, and particularly that second line in verse 1. So which one is right? I'm not for sure. But what I am sure about is this. Whichever interpretation you take here, the main point of each of them is the same. The main point is we make plans. We plan. But the one who ultimately determines whether or not our plans come about is God. Like he's the one who ultimately determines what happens and whether or not our plans that we make are fulfilled and accomplished. If you look down at verse 9, look at verse 9. It says the same exact thing, but in a different way. It says, the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. And so again, we plan, we make plans, but the Lord establishes our steps, meaning the Lord establishes what actually happens. He determines what actually happens. He establishes our steps and determines whether our plans are actually fulfilled. We plan, but the Lord establishes what actually happens. And Proverbs isn't the only book in the Bible that talks about this. that talks about God being sovereign over our plans. Remember the New Testament book of James, in James chapter 4, specifically in verses 13 through 15? James writes this. He says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make profit." And so he's talking about those who have plans. They plan to work, they plan to travel, they plan to make profits, so they have plans. But James says, "Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you're a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead," and here it comes, "you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that." So then again, James isn't saying that we shouldn't plan. But what he's saying is that when we do plan, we need to realize that the only way that our plans are going to happen is if the Lord wills. That if the Lord wills, then our plans will happen. They'll be accomplished. If the Lord doesn't will, then our plans won't happen. It's pretty simple. We make plans. He's the one that ultimately determines whether or not those plans come to fruition or not. You don't determine that. I don't determine that. The Lord ultimately determines that. And so then if you're planning on going to lunch with somebody after the service, that will happen only if the Lord wills. If you plan on going to work in the morning, tomorrow morning, that will only happen if the Lord wills. If you plan on getting married next Saturday at 4 o'clock in Buffalo, Missouri, that will only happen if the Lord wills. Everybody with me? Anyway, our plans, 100%, completely dependent upon the Lord's mercy and the Lord's will. He's sovereign over our plans. So then, if that's true, then how should the reality of that truth then affect and impact how we plan and how we make plans? In other words, how should God's sovereignty over our plans affect our planning? Well, 4 ways, and probably more than these 4 ways, but 4 ways that I have on your handout there. 4 ways that the reality of God's sovereignty over our plans should affect how we plan and our planning. The first way is this: if God is sovereign over our plans, then we should hold our plans loosely. We should hold our plans loosely. In other words, if God is sovereign over our plans, if He's the one who ultimately determines whether or not our plans are fulfilled, then none of our plans are ever guaranteed. None of them. And so we should hold them loosely, not hold them with a tight grip as if they're guaranteed. They're not. None of them. Secondly, if God is sovereign over our plans, then we should be content whether or not our plans ever come to fruition. We should be content whether or not our plans ever come to fruition. In other words, if God is sovereign over our plans, then He knows what's best. Period. He knows what's best for us. And so then if He doesn't allow what we're planning and what we're desiring and what we're expecting to come to fruition, then if God knows what's best for us and if He's all wise, then we should be content with that. We should be at peace with that. We should be at rest with that. Like that doesn't mean there won't be tears. That doesn't mean that there won't be sadness. That doesn't mean that there won't be disappointment in the loss of an unfulfilled plan. But it also means there shouldn't be despair. It also means you shouldn't be just your life utterly crushed. Because we know that God is a good, loving Father who knows what's best for us and is all wise. Third, then, if God is sovereign over our plans, then it should free us from the stress and worry of having to fulfill our plans. It should free us from the stress and worry of having to fulfill our plans. Does that make sense there? That the reason it should free us from the stress and worry of having to accomplish and fulfill our plans is because you're not the one who ultimately accomplishes it to begin with. God does. He's sovereign over it. If it's His will, it's going to happen. If it's not going to happen. That doesn't mean you don't work hard. It doesn't mean that you don't plan. It doesn't mean that you're not faithful and all those things. Yes, you're all that. But you're all that without stress. You're all that without worry. You're all that without all of that because it's not ultimately up to you. It's ultimately up to Him. Fourth and finally then, if God is sovereign over our plans, then we should still plan. Like, this is really important here. Because it could be easy for some to hear, like everything I've said up to this point in verse 1 and verse 9 here, and to think, okay, if God is the one who ultimately determines what happens to my plans and what happens in my life, then why plan? Because whatever He wants to happen is going to happen. So why even plan? And listen, that's a great question. That's a good question. Because on one hand, right, and we've seen this especially in Proverbs, again, we should plan. Making plans is good. And so because of that, because that's emphasized all throughout Proverbs and the Bible, your plans matter. Your plans are important. And so you should plan. At the same time, so there's that truth. At the same time, the Bible teaches that God is sovereign over our plans, and He's the one who ultimately determines whether or not our plans should come to fruition and are fulfilled or not. So then how can both of those things be true? I don't know. That's the answer. Because the Bible says that they're true. That's the answer. And because of these two parallel truths, then we shouldn't minimize the role of planning, and also we shouldn't neglect and minimize the role of God's sovereignty. You plan and you work hard in what you've planned, but you do so with an open hand, realizing that God is sovereign over it, and He's the ultimate one who's going to determine, according to His will, whether those plans come to fruition or not. Second characteristic then of wise planning then is this. Wise planning understands that we can easily deceive ourselves and that God alone knows the intentions and the motives of our hearts. Wise planning understands that we can easily deceive ourselves and that God alone knows the intentions and motives of our hearts. We see this next in verse 2. Look there with me. It says, all the ways of a man are pure in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirit. In other words, what is it saying here, especially that first part of verse 2 here, is saying, and we know this, right? Is that oftentimes it's easy for us to think that our plans and what we plan to do and what we're doing, that there's nothing wrong with it. That it's right. That our plans and what we're doing, they're pure. They're innocent. There's nothing wrong with it. So that's what we think from our perspective. At the same time, though, God knows our hearts. So what that second line of verse 2 means, the Lord weighs the spirit. Meaning the Lord judges, He evaluates, He examines the motives and the intentions of our hearts. And so then the point of verse 2 then that Solomon's making here is that we can easily deceive ourselves. We can think that what we're doing, what we're planning on doing, it's pure, it's right, it's clean, it's innocent, there's nothing wrong with it. But at the same time, God knows our hearts. He knows the intentions, He knows the motives of our hearts. And this is so important when it comes to making plans. Like in your mind, you might be thinking, there's nothing wrong with planning to have this career. Or there's nothing wrong in moving to this house. There's nothing wrong with having kids.
There's nothing wrong with remaining single. There's nothing wrong with being married. And in your mind, those plans that you're planning, they're pure, they're innocent. There's nothing wrong with any of those from your perspective. But what you have to keep in mind is God knows your heart. He knows your motives. He knows the real reason that you're planning these things. He knows the real reason for why you want to do these things. He knows your motive. He knows your intentions. He knows the real reason and motive that's behind your plans. We can be easily deceived into thinking our plans are great. There's nothing wrong with them. And be fooled and be deceived with improper, self-centered, idolatrous motives and intentions in our hearts that we might be even completely blind to. And so, if that's true then, like if we're easily deceived in this way, and if God alone knows our hearts, then how should that affect then how we plan? How should the reality of this truth then affect how we plan and go about planning? Well, it should affect it in two ways. You see this on your handout there. First, we should pray and ask God to reveal the motives and intentions of our hearts. We should pray and ask God to reveal the motives and intentions of our hearts. In other words, if we're easily deceived, like verse 2 is talking about here, into thinking, hey, I'm doing the right thing, there's nothing wrong with my plans, but the reality is we don't know the thoughts and intentions and motives of our hearts, but God does, and God knows that they're improper and impure, and we're just doing this, making these plans for selfish reasons, then before we plan anything and act on those plans, we need to get time alone with the Lord and ask Him to examine our hearts and to reveal the intentions and the motives of our hearts for wanting to do what we want to do. Secondly, then, we should seek godly counsel from others. We should seek godly counsel from others. And again, that makes sense, doesn't it? Like if we're so easily deceived into these things that we're planning and not knowing the real intentions and motives of our hearts, we need to pull other people into our lives who will ask us really hard questions, who will probe our heart, and who will help to reveal the real motives and intentions of our hearts. And to avoid those sort of people and those sort of conversations, to get at that sort of heart motive level for your plans, is to deceive yourself. And so God has placed prayer and He's put the godly counsel of others to help us not deceive ourselves when we plan. Thirdly then, the third characteristic of wise planning is this, is that wise planning involves entrusting our plans to the Lord and trusting Him to establish them however He sees fit. We see this next in verse 3. Look there with me in verse 3. It says, "Commit your works to the Lord, and your plans will be established." Commit your works to the Lord, and your plans will be established. That word commit there, it literally means to roll. That's what that word commit literally means. It means to roll. And so in Genesis 29, verse 3, it's a reference to a shepherd rolling a stone away. Just rolling a stone away. Within the context of verse 3, it's the idea of rolling our works, or rolling our plans to the Lord. Meaning we're rolling them to Him. We're giving them completely to Him. We're entrusting our works. We're entrusting our plans. We're releasing them. We're handing them over to the Lord. And the picture here, it's a picture of trust, right? That rather than trusting ourselves, rather than relying on ourselves to accomplish and fulfill our plans, instead we're rolling them to the Lord. We're entrusting them to the Lord. We're handing them over to the Lord to establish them and fulfill them however He sees fit according to His sovereign plan. And that last part there that I just said, it's really important to remember here. Because if you look at the second line of verse 3, your plans will be established, that doesn't mean that God's going to establish whatever plans we have as long as we just commit them to Him. So then if you just entrust to God your plan to buy a Learjet, then verse 3 isn't saying that He'll establish that. Meaning, that doesn't mean He's just, you entrusted me with that plan, and so I guess according to verse 3, I'm obligated to establish it. So voila, here's a Learjet. Like that's how people use verse 3, that's not what verse 3 is saying. Instead, you have to remember verse 1 and verse 9, that God is sovereign over our plans. He's the one who determines whether our plans are actually fulfilled or not. So our role and our response, though, is to release our plans to the Lord, to hand our plans to the Lord, to rely upon Him to accomplish our plans however He sees fit according to His sovereign plan and purposes. And so if they're according to a sovereign plan and purposes, then they'll be established. So practically speaking, what's this mean? It means you release your career that you've always dreamed of, you've always planned for. You release it, you entrust it, you hand it over to Him. Or the marriage, the family you've always envisioned, the marriage, the family you've always planned, the expectations that you've always had of what life was going to be like when you reach the age that you are right now. You release those dreams. You release those expectations. You hand those plans over to the Lord. You roll them to Him, entrusting Him to establish them however He sees fit according to a sovereign plan. But let's be honest, right? That's hard. Like it's easy to talk about and easy to do in a sermon like this. But that's hard to do. So I don't know about you, but oftentimes, like, I want to hold on to my plans. I don't want to roll those. I don't want to release those. I don't want to hand those over to the Lord. And same thing with you, right? You've got plans. You've got dreams. You have expectations, longings of what life is going to be like and what life was going to be like when you reach the age that you are right now. Unfulfilled longings, unfulfilled plans, unfulfilled dreams, unfulfilled expectations. And oftentimes we're afraid to release those and entrust those and hand those over to the Lord. And usually the reason we're afraid to do that is for two reasons. One is that you just don't trust Him. You really don't trust Him. That you're afraid that if you hand this dream, this plan, this expectation over to the Lord, He might say no. It might not ever be fulfilled. It might not ever come to fruition. And so you're going to hold on to it yourself to fulfill it yourself. Second reason, though, we oftentimes don't want to hand our dreams and expectations and plans to the Lord is because that plan, that dream, that expectation, it's an idol in your life. It's an idol. Meaning, like it's your identity. It's where your value, it's where your worth is found. And so then imagining life without that plan being fulfilled, it's like imagining a living hell here on earth. You can't imagine that. Like life without that plan being fulfilled, without that dream coming true, would lose all its meaning. Life would lose all of its purpose. And so you keep on holding on to it because it's an idol in your life. Like if that's you, if you can relate to any of that this morning, then let me just remind you of this. It's that the God that we're to hand our plans over to, He's not evil. He's not stingy. He's not wicked. He's not selfish. He's not unrighteous. He's not unmerciful. Instead, this God that we're to hand and release our plans to, Like He's really, really good. He's really, really gracious. He's really, really kind. He's really, really compassionate and caring and merciful and a loving Father that you can trust and who's much, much better at satisfying than any plan or any dream that you've ever thought of in your life. And so why in the world hold on to it? Like, release it to Him. And I guarantee you that you won't ever be disappointed for doing that. The fourth and final characteristic of wise planning we see here is this, is that wise planning entails making plans that fit with God's purpose. Wise planning entails making plans that fit with God's purpose. We see this next there in verse 4. Look there with me. It says, the Lord has made everything for its purpose, even the wicked for the day of trouble. So, first line there, everything that God has made has a purpose. Everything. Everything that God has made, everything that God has created has a purpose. So what that first line there, verse 4 means. And that includes the wicked. That God even has a plan, God even has a purpose for the wicked. And God's plan, God's purpose for the wicked is, He says, the day of trouble. That's how it's translated in the ESV. That phrase, day of trouble, can also be translated as the day of disaster, meaning the day of judgment. Like that's God's ultimate purpose. That's God's ultimate end. That's the ultimate result of the wicked. It's trouble, it's disaster, it's judgment. But the key point that we're supposed to see here in verse 4 is the connection between God having a purpose for everything that He's made and our plans. And to be able to see the connection between those two things. That if God has a purpose for everything He's made, then we need to make sure that our plans fit with the purpose for everything that God's made. Does that make sense? In other words, if you plan to become rich and retire by the age of 60 so you can sit on the beach and collect seashells and just selfishly indulge yourself for the rest of your life, then I can guarantee you that that plan doesn't fit with God's purpose, and so you shouldn't plan that. Is everybody with me? Is everybody with me? Okay, some of you are like, no, because that's your plan. That's not fit. Selfishly indulging yourself for the rest of your life doesn't fit with God's purpose, so that doesn't need to be your plan. Or if you plan to divorce your spouse so you can be free, that doesn't fit with God's purpose, so you shouldn't plan that. That's how we plan, right? What's God's purpose for everything He's made? What's God's purpose for work? What's God's purpose for singleness? What's God's purpose for marriage? What's God's purpose for parenting and children? What's God's purpose for this and that and that? What's God's purpose for everything He's made? And then plan according to His purpose. Like, that's one of the first questions we should ask when we're planning anything. Does my plan fit with, does it align with God's purpose? So that again, God created marriage. And so if you're planning on getting married, then you need to ask yourself, does this guy, does this girl, will this marriage fit with God's purpose of marriage? God created work. So if you're planning on changing jobs or changing careers, then you need to ask yourself, what is God's purpose for work? And then to ask yourself, do my plans for work then fit with and align themselves with God's purpose for work, which is ultimately to serve others and to love your neighbor through. So in other words, we don't just make plans flippantly. Sounds good. Always wanted to do that. We don't make plans casually or just based on our desires and what we want to do or what others want us to do. Instead, we make plans first. What's God's purpose? then we ask ourselves, how can I plan accordingly? How do my plans align themselves with God's purpose? And so then, there's two ditches here, right, when it comes to planning. On one side, there's this ditch of laziness. There's this ditch of not planning. There's this ditch of just winging everything. Not planning anything at all. That's a ditch we need to avoid. On the other side, though, there's this ditch of making an idol of our plans, putting our hope in our plans, relying on our plans, planning so we can feel like we're in control of our life, and all of that. That's another ditch. So then, how do we plan accordingly to avoid these two ditches? We plan accordingly by aligning our plans with God's plans and God's purposes. We plan accordingly by going to Him in prayer and asking Him, examine my heart, examine my motives, examine my intentions for this plan. And then we entrust, we hand over our plans to Him. And we rest in His sovereign control then over our plans and over our lives, and allowing Him to determine what in the world and whether or not our plans are ever fulfilled and whether or not they're ever accomplished. But here's the kicker in all this that we know, but that would be good to remind us of. If we do this, like this is the warning, okay? Can't say you weren't warned. If you follow these 4 characteristics of planning, if you release your plans to the Lord, if you trust in His sovereign control over those plans, then here's the warning and what that's going to mean. That means that many of your plans, many of your dreams, many of your expectations, many of your desires won't ever be fulfilled and won't ever happen and won't ever come to fruition. That's what that means. And sometimes that's really, really going to hurt. Because what you're planning is something that you've deeply longed for a long, long, long time. And you've deeply desired for a long, long, long time. You can't imagine life without that. And because of that, when God says no, or when God shuts the door to that, and when you live your entire life and you never see that plan ever accomplished, it's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult. Like deep down, you're going to feel like you're missing out on something. Deep down, you're going to feel like God's ripping you off. You're going to feel like God's playing a bad trick on you. And it's in those times then that we need to remember that even if none, like not one of our plans are ever fulfilled in this life, and if none of your plans ever come true, and if you never experience, if you just over and over again, day after day, year after year, experience the death of plan after plan after plan after plan, then in those moments, then you need to remember that there is one plan for your life that is sure and certain and guaranteed. And that one plan isn't a plan that you came up with yourself. Instead, that one plan is a plan that God came up with for you. And you want to know what that plan is? Here's God's plan for you as a Christian. It's Jeremiah 29, starting in verse 11. God says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will hear you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. And I will be found by you, declares the Lord." And now listen to this. And I will restore your fortunes and gather you from all the nations and all the places where I have driven you, declares the Lord. And I will bring you back to the place from which I sent you into exile. So it's important to don't misunderstand these verses here, right? This plan, these plans that God promised here were first given to the people of Israel in the Old Testament when they were in exile in Babylon. That at that specific time in history, God promised them that even though they're in exile, He has a plan for them. And that plan involved rescuing them out of exile, bringing them back to the promised land of Canaan, and restoring them back into the land of great prosperity, this great fortune. And if you read your Bible, then you know that God fulfilled that plan. He was faithful to fulfill that plan, accomplish that plan that He had promised. At the same time, though, this plan in Jeremiah 29 that God promised to Israel in the Old Testament, this was just the initial fulfillment of that plan that He had promised. That this plan wouldn't be ultimately fulfilled until Jesus came. And here's how Jesus fulfilled Jeremiah 29, verses 11 through 14. That just like Israel's sin caused God to remove them from the land and place them in exile out of God's kingdom, so God has done the same thing to us, spiritually speaking. That because of our sin, we have been banished from God's favorable presence and exiled from God's kingdom in judgment because of our sin. And this is exactly why Jesus came. That Jesus came to be the ultimate fulfillment of Jeremiah 29, 11 through 14. And He came to be the means by which we are rescued out of exile and restored back to God's kingdom. And the way that He accomplished this was by putting Himself as our substitute in our place and dying for us and taking the judgment that we deserve in our place on the cross for all the sins that we've committed against God. Because of that, then, we're no longer under the judgment of God anymore and can return out of exile into God's favorable presence and God's kingdom. But it gets even, that's good news, isn't it? But it gets even better than that, because that's not even the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan for us. Instead, God's plan that He promised Jeremiah in Jeremiah 29 won't be ultimately fulfilled until Jesus returns. That when Jesus returns back to this earth, then He's going to usher in God's kingdom here on earth. He's going to usher in a new creation, a perfect land, that the land of Canaan